Hello everyone, and welcome back to Sleepless Campfire. Tonight, we travel into the forgotten backroads of the American Southwest places, where ancient traditions meet modern skepticism. And what remains are stories that refuse to be explained away. Across these mesas, canyons, and desert highways are accounts drawn from witness reports, police files, and archived broadcasts. Each one verified, recorded, and retold in their own words. The Navajo Nation spans across Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah, a landscape of stark beauty and profound isolation. Within this 27,000 square mile territory exists a belief system as complex as the geological formations that dominate the horizon. For centuries, the Diné people have spoken of beings that walk between worlds, entities that science cannot classify and that outsiders rarely glimpse. But in recent decades, as modern civilization has encroached upon these sacred lands, the encounters have increased, not among tribal members who carry these traditions, but among outsiders, government workers, truckers, medical personnel, and law enforcement officers who have witnessed phenomena they cannot explain. These are not tales told around campfires for entertainment. They are documented incidents filed in official reports, recorded in emergency dispatch logs, and corroborated by multiple witnesses. What makes these accounts particularly compelling is how they align with ancient Navajo warnings. Beings described in petroglyphs and oral traditions for generations are now being encountered by people with no prior knowledge of such legends. The consistency across time and culture creates a pattern that cannot be dismissed as mere coincidence or superstition. The Navajo people have long understood that certain places serve as thresholds between worlds. They have protocols for protection, ceremonies for balance, and a deep respect for powers beyond human comprehension. But what happens when those who don't share this understanding stumble into these spaces? What happens when modern technology meets ancient forces? Now, let us begin with our first story. It was late October of 2014 when Arizona State Park Ranger Michael Torres began his final patrol of the season at Canyon de Chelly. The park, located entirely within Navajo Nation boundaries, would soon close to visitors for the winter months. Torres had worked at the park for 3 years and had developed a respectful relationship with the local Navajo families who lived within the canyon boundaries. The autumn season had always been Torres's favorite time at Canyon de Chelly. The cottonwood trees that lined the canyon floor turned brilliant shades of gold and amber, creating a stunning contrast against the red sandstone cliffs. The air carried the crisp scent of approaching winter, and the tourist crowds had thinned, leaving the park in a state of peaceful transition. Torres appreciated these quiet moments before the winter closure, when the canyon seemed to revert to its ancient self, speaking in whispers of wind through the rock formations. Torres had transferred to Canyon de Chelly after a difficult stint at a busy state park near Phoenix, where constant visitor issues and resource management challenges had left him burned out. The relative solitude and cultural richness of Canyon de Chelly had been exactly what he needed. He had spent his first months learning the canyon's geological history, studying the thousands of years of human habitation documented in the cliff dwellings and petroglyphs, and most importantly, building relationships with the Navajo families who still lived and farmed within the canyon boundaries. The afternoon light cast long shadows across the canyon walls as Torres drove his marked vehicle along the South Rim Drive. He stopped at each overlook to check for visitors lingering after sunset. At Spider Rock Overlook, he found an elderly Navajo man sitting on a stone wall, staring into the canyon where 2 sandstone spires rose 800 feet from the canyon floor. Spider Rock held special significance in Navajo tradition. According to legend, it was the home of Spider Woman, a powerful deity who taught the Navajo people how to weave. Torres had heard many stories about the place from tribal members over the years, each adding layers to his understanding of the canyon's cultural importance. He approached the man quietly, not wanting to disturb what appeared to be a moment of contemplation. "They're more active this time of year," the man said without turning to face Torres. "The changing seasons make the barrier thin." Torres was accustomed to such cryptic statements from tribal members. In his 3 years at the park, he had learned that Navajo communication often carried multiple layers of meaning, with directness sometimes replaced by metaphor and allusion. He paused a respectful distance from the man, waiting for an invitation to approach. Torres approached respectfully. "What's more active, sir?" The old man, who later identified himself as John Tso, finally turned. His face was weathered like the canyon walls themselves, with deep lines that seemed to hold stories of decades lived in close connection to this land. His eyes, though clouded with age, held a clarity that suggested they missed little. "The ones who walk between skins," Tso said, his voice raspy but steady. "They sense when the world is changing." Torres nodded politely, accustomed to such conversations with tribal members. He made a note in his daily logs about the encounter at 4:47 p.m. What he didn't record was the uneasy feeling that settled over him as Tso spoke. There was something in the old man's tone, a seriousness that went beyond the usual references to traditional beliefs that Torres had encountered before. The barrier between worlds grows thin as the seasons change. Tso continued, as if sensing Torres's skepticism. "My grandfather told me that the holy people walk more freely during these times. Sometimes they take forms that confuse us, that test our understanding." Torres had heard references to skinwalkers, malevolent witches in Navajo tradition who could transform into animals. But Tso's words suggested something different, more complex than the simplified stories sometimes shared with outsiders. "Should visitors be concerned?" Torres asked, making a mental note to consider whether any additional safety warnings were needed for the remaining visitors. Tso shook his head slowly. "They don't bother those who respect this place. But those who come with loud voices and careless hearts, sometimes they see things that change them." As Torres continued his patrol, Tso's words lingered in his mind. He had always approached his job with a practical, science-based mindset. But 3 years in Canyon de Chelly had taught him that there were dimensions to this place that couldn't be fully captured in geological surveys or visitor statistics. The canyon held a power that went beyond its physical beauty, a presence that seemed to watch from the shadows of the cliff dwellings and whisper through the wind. 2 hours later, as darkness fell across the canyon, Torres was completing his final stop at Junction Overlook. The sun had disappeared below the canyon rim, leaving a brilliant display of oranges and purples in the western sky. Torres had always found this time of day both beautiful and unsettling, the way the canyon transformed from familiar landscape to mysterious realm of shadows and echoes. He had just locked the restroom facility when he heard movement in the scrub brush below the overlook. Grabbing his flashlight, he swept the beam across the area, expecting to see coyotes or perhaps a stray dog. Wildlife encounters were common in the park, and Torres had learned to approach them with caution but without alarm. Instead, the beam caught something moving with impossible speed across the canyon floor, something that appeared to be running on 2 legs but moved with the fluid grace of a mountain lion. Torres estimated the distance to be approximately 300 yards. Yet whatever he was watching covered ground that would take a human several minutes in mere seconds. Torres felt his heart rate increase as he struggled to process what he was seeing. The figure moved with a speed that defied human capability, yet its bipedal motion was unmistakable. It navigated the rugged terrain of the canyon floor with an ease that suggested intimate familiarity with every rock and depression. He raised his binoculars, adjusting the focus. The figure paused near the canyon wall, turning slightly in his direction. Even at that distance, Torres could make out an unnaturally elongated shape that seemed both human and animal simultaneously. The proportions were wrong: limbs too long, torso too narrow, head elongated in a way that seemed to blend human and animal characteristics. Before he could process what he was seeing, the figure scaled the nearly vertical cliff face with what appeared to be no effort at all. Torres watched in disbelief as it moved up the rock wall, using handholds that seemed non-existent to his eyes, covering in seconds what would take an experienced rock climber with specialized equipment hours to accomplish. Torres radio dispatch at 6:52 p.m. This is Ranger Torres at Canyon de Chelly. I've observed an unidentified individual climbing the north wall near Junction Overlook, requesting assistance. His voice remained steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. Years of training as a park ranger had taught him to maintain composure in unusual situations, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for what he had just witnessed. The dispatcher's response came with static interference. Ranger Torres, we have no reports of climbers in that area. Are you certain it wasn't a bighorn sheep? Negative, Torres replied, his voice steady despite his racing heart. This was bipedal, and it moved too fast for any human I've ever seen. Torres continued to watch the cliff face, but the figure had disappeared over the rim. He scanned the area with his binoculars, searching for any sign of movement. But the canyon had returned to its evening stillness. The only sounds were the wind whistling through the rock formations and the distant call of a night bird. By the time 2 Navajo Nation police officers arrived 27 minutes later, there was no sign of the figure. Torres led them to the overlook and pointed out where he had seen the climb. Officer Benali, a 20-year veteran of the force, examined the cliff face through binoculars. There's no sign of climbing equipment, Benali noted, and those handholds would challenge the most experienced climbers, not to mention nobody would attempt that in darkness. Benali's tone was matter-of-fact, but Torres could see the concern in his eyes. Like many Navajo Nation police officers, Benali had likely encountered situations that defied easy explanation, balancing his law enforcement training with cultural knowledge that sometimes offered alternative frameworks for understanding unusual events. The younger officer, Yazzie, scanned the area with a powerful spotlight. No tracks below either. Whatever it was, it didn't leave footprints. Torres felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. That's impossible. The ground is soft there. Anything that size would leave prints. The 3 men stood in silence as the implications of Torres's statement settled between them. The lack of evidence was in some ways more disturbing than clear proof would have been. It suggested something that operated outside the normal laws of physics and nature. Benali lowered his binoculars and turned to Torres. Ranger, how familiar are you with the stories about this place? Torres shook his head. I'm respectful of local beliefs, but I'm a practical man. Some things can't be explained practically, Benali said quietly. My grandmother used to say that when the seasons change, the skinwalkers become more active. They test the boundaries between worlds. Benali's reference to skinwalkers sent a chill through Torres, despite the warm evening air. In Navajo tradition, skinwalkers were believed to be witches who could transform into animals, moving with supernatural speed and strength. They were considered dangerous entities that operated outside normal moral and natural laws. The 3 men stood in silence as the wind picked up, whistling through the canyon. Torres felt as though they were being watched from multiple directions, though the overlook offered no cover. The darkness seemed to press in on them, and Torres found himself constantly looking over his shoulder his ranger training suddenly feeling inadequate for the situation. At 7:38 p.m., as they prepared to leave, Torres noticed something glinting on the ground near where he had first seen the figure. He knelt to examine it, a single feather, unlike any local bird species he could identify. It was iridescent, shifting colors in his flashlight beam from deep blue to purple to black. When he tried to pick it up, it disintegrated into dust between his fingers. The officers exchanged glances, but said nothing about the feather. Torres made a note of it in his report, but he knew that words on paper couldn't capture the unsettling quality of what he had witnessed, the impossible movement, the lack of tracks, the feather that seemed to exist between solid and insubstantial. Torres filed an official report the next morning, documenting everything he had witnessed. The report was assigned case number NPD 148829 and remains open in the Navajo Nation Police unsolved files. 6 months later, Torres requested a transfer to a state park outside tribal boundaries. In his exit interview, he cited only personal reasons for the move. And in the months following his encounter, Torres found himself increasingly unsettled by the experience. He had always considered himself a rational person, grounded in science and observable phenomena. But what he had witnessed that October evening defied all logical explanation. The figure's impossible speed and climbing ability, the lack of tracks or other evidence, the mysterious feather that disintegrated at his touch, these elements refused to fit into his understanding of the natural world. Torres had attempted to research possible explanations, consulting with biologists, geologists, and even a parapsychologist. None could offer a satisfactory account of what he had witnessed. The most plausible scientific explanation suggested that fatigue and the play of light in the canyon might have created an optical illusion. But Torres knew in his heart that what he had seen was real. His transfer to a state park in northern Arizona brought some relief, but Torres found that the experience had changed him in ways he couldn't fully articulate. He had developed a heightened awareness of the natural world, but also a recognition that there might be dimensions to reality that existed beyond human understanding. He became more thoughtful in his interactions with visitors, more respectful of indigenous knowledge systems that acknowledged phenomena Western science couldn't explain. No trace of the figure was ever found, though Torres would occasionally wake in the night with the memory of that impossible climb burned into his mind, a movement so contrary to the laws of physics that it challenged everything he believed about the natural world. Sometimes, when he was alone in the wilderness of his new park, he would feel a familiar sense of being watched, a prickle on the back of his neck that reminded him of that evening at Canyon de Chelly, 5 years after the incident. Torres received an unexpected package in the mail. It contained a beautifully woven rug with a design that incorporated elements from the petroglyphs of Canyon de Chelly. There was no return address, only a small note written in a spidery hand. Some things are remembered even when they can't be explained. Torres never learned who sent the rug, but he displayed it prominently in his home, a reminder of the mystery that had reshaped his understanding of the world. The encounter at Canyon de Chelly remained unresolved in official records, but for Torres, it had become a touchstone, a recognition that the world contained mysteries that might never be solved, but demanded respect nonetheless. As he continued his career as a park ranger, Torres carried with him the lesson of that October evening, that some places held power beyond human comprehension, and that the wisest approach to such mysteries was not always to seek answers, but to acknowledge the limits of understanding and move forward with humility and respect. 300 miles northwest of Canyon de Chelly, long-haul trucker Raymond Harrison was making his weekly run from Phoenix to Shiprock, New Mexico. The route took him along Highway 160, which cuts across the northern portion of Navajo Nation. Harrison had been making this run for 7 years and knew every mile marker, every rest stop, and every stretch of unreliable cell service. It was November 2nd, 2016, just after midnight, when Harrison's CB radio crackled with an unusual transmission. Most truckers on this route used Channel 19, but this voice came through on Channel 9, the emergency channel reserved for official use only. If you're traveling the 160 between Kayenta and Mexican Hat, pull over and wait for daylight, the voice said. It was calm but carried an urgency that made Harrison's hands tighten on the steering wheel. There's something on the road tonight, something that doesn't belong here. Harrison glanced at his dashboard clock, 12:17 a.m. He was approximately 23 miles east of Kayenta, approaching the steep descent into the valley that led to Mexican Hat. The 2-lane highway was empty ahead, his headlights cutting through the darkness. Breaker 19. This is the Nighthawk, Harrison replied into his CB. What exactly are we dealing with out here? Weather report shows clear skies. The response came after a moment of static. Not weather, not animals either. Something that walks like a man, but isn't one. It's been sighted near mile marker 438. Multiple truckers have reported it. Harrison felt a prickle of unease. In all his years on this route, he'd never heard an emergency warning like this. He slowed his rig as he approached the descent, the road winding down into the valley below. At 12:24 a.m., as he rounded a sharp curve, Harrison saw something standing on the shoulder ahead. It appeared to be a person hitchhiking, but something was wrong with the proportions. The figure was too tall, too thin, and stood in an unnatural stillness despite the strong wind whipping across the highway. Harrison eased off the accelerator, his truck slowing as he approached. As his headlights illuminated the figure, he felt his breath catch in his throat. It was dressed in what appeared to be traditional Navajo clothing, but the face was wrong, elongated with features that seemed to shift and blur in his headlights. The figure raised an arm, not in the typical hitchhiking gesture, but with the palm facing forward in what Harrison would later describe as a gesture of warning. As his truck drew closer, perhaps 50 yards away, the figure turned its head, and Harrison saw that its profile was impossible, the nose and jaw extending further than any human face should. At that moment, Harrison's engine began to sputter, though his fuel gauge showed 3/4 of a tank. His dashboard lights flickered erratically. The truck lost power rapidly, despite his foot pressing the accelerator to the floor. He grabbed his CB microphone. This is the Nighthawk on Highway 160 eastbound. I'm experiencing mechanical failure at approximately mile marker 437. There's an individual on the roadside who may need assistance. The response was immediate and filled with static. Nighthawk, do not exit your vehicle under any circumstances. I repeat, do not engage. We're dispatching assistance from Kayenta. Harrison's truck coasted to a stop about 30 yards from the figure. For a moment, they remained in that tableau. Harrison frozen in his cab, the figure standing motionless on the shoulder. Then the figure began to move toward the truck, not walking, but gliding, its feet seemingly not touching the ground. Harrison reached for his door lock, though he knew it was already engaged. He watched in horrified fascination as the figure approached his driver's side window. The face was even more unsettling up close. The eyes appeared as black voids, the mouth a thin line that didn't move. The figure placed a hand against the window, and Harrison recoiled at what he saw. The hand was elongated with too many joints, the fingers ending in what appeared to be claws rather than nails. A low humming sound filled the cab, seeming to come from inside Harrison's own head. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the figure turned and walked back toward the shoulder. Harrison watched in his side mirror as it seemed to dissolve into the darkness beyond the highway. A moment later, His engine roared back to life, dashboard lights returning to normal. Navajo Nation police arrived at 12:58 a.m. to find Harrison shaken but unharmed. Officer Bigay examined the area where Harrison had seen the figure, but found no footprints or other evidence of anyone having been there. "You're the third trucker this week," Bigay told Harrison as he completed his report. "Same description, same location. Whatever you saw, others have seen it too." Harrison's truck showed no signs of mechanical issues when examined by a mechanic in Kayenta the next day. The incident report, filed as NPD 16-4471, remains unexplained. Harrison now takes an alternate route that adds 120 miles to his journey, though he's never been able to fully explain why he refuses to drive Highway 160 at night. Dr. Verbaz Bosch Sarah Mitchell had worked at Tuba City Regional Healthcare for 5 years when the unusual cases began appearing in early 2018. As an emergency room physician, she was accustomed to treating a wide range of injuries and illnesses common to the Navajo Nation. But nothing had prepared her for what would arrive in the early hours of March 15th. The call came in at 2:13 a.m. from a paramedic team responding to a scene 47 miles outside Tuba City. The report was confusing a family of 4 found in their vehicle apparently unharmed but unresponsive. The paramedics couldn't determine a cause. When the ambulance arrived at 3:27 a.m., Mitchell was part of the emergency team waiting. The family of father, mother, and 2 children aged 8 and 11 were brought in on stretchers. All were conscious, but in a catatonic state. Eyes open but unresponsive to stimuli. Vital signs were normal across the board. Blood work showed no toxins, no signs of seizure activity, no indication of stroke or other neurological events. CT scans came back clear. Yet the family remained unresponsive, staring at the ceiling with what Mitchell could only describe as an expression of profound terror. At 4:42 a.m., the father suddenly sat up, his eyes focusing on Mitchell. "Don't look at it," he whispered, his voice raspy. "Whatever you do, don't look at it when it calls your name." Then he lay back down, resuming the same catatonic state as before. Mitchell noted the exact time and words in her report, though she couldn't explain what had just happened. The hospital contacted the Navajo Nation police, who sent Officer Chi to investigate. When he arrived at 5:30 a.m. and saw the family, he immediately requested to speak with Mitchell privately. "Doctor, have you been working with the Navajo people long?" Chi asked, his expression grave. 5 years, Mitchell replied. "Why?" "These symptoms," Chi said, consulting his notebook. "They match stories I've heard from my grandparents. When someone encounters certain entities, they can become lost between worlds. Their body is here, but part of them remains elsewhere." Mitchell felt a chill despite the warm hospital air. "Officer, with all due respect, we need to find a medical explanation. There are 4 lives at stake here." "I understand," Chi said quietly. "But sometimes the explanation isn't medical. Sometimes it's older than medicine." At 6:18 a.m., the youngest child began to speak, though her eyes remained fixed on the ceiling. "It wore grandfather's face," she said in a monotone voice. "But its shadow was wrong. It didn't match." Mitchell knelt by the child's bed. "What do you mean, sweetie? Whose shadow was it?" The child turned her head slowly to look at Mitchell, and for the first time, her eyes focused. Not a shadow person, standing behind grandfather's face. Then, like the father, she returned to her catatonic state. Mitchell made a note of the exact words, though they made no medical sense. At 7:45 a.m., a traditional Navajo medicine man arrived. having been called by a family member who worked at the hospital. Mitchell watched as he performed a ceremony at the foot of each bed, chanting in a language she didn't understand while holding feathers and herbs. At 8:22 a.m., the mother began to stir, her eyes blinking as if awakening from a long sleep. "Where are we?" she asked, looking around the emergency room. What happened? Her awakening seemed to trigger something in the rest of the family. Within minutes, all were responsive and asking questions, though none had clear memory of what had transpired. The police investigation revealed that the family had been returning home from a ceremony when their vehicle broke down near a place known as Window Rock. The father had walked to a nearby dwelling for help while the family remained in the car. When he returned with assistance, the family was found in their catatonic state. The official medical report documented the incident as a temporary collective neurological event of unknown etiology. But in her private notes, Mitchell wrote, "I have no medical explanation for what I witnessed today." The timing of the recovery coinciding exactly with the traditional ceremony cannot be dismissed as coincidence. Mitchell never saw another case like it during her time at Tuba City Regional, but the incident changed her perspective on the intersection between traditional beliefs and modern medicine. She now approaches cases involving Navajo patients with a new respect for the possibility that some phenomena exist beyond current scientific understanding. The family fully recovered with no lingering effects, though they refused to discuss the incident with medical staff or police. Their vehicle showed no signs of mechanical failure when examined by a mechanic, adding another layer of mystery to an already inexplicable event. Dr. James Chen, a geologist with the U.S. Geological Survey, had been conducting research in the Chuska Mountains for 6 weeks when he made a discovery that would challenge his scientific understanding. It was June 2019, and Chen was part of a team studying unusual seismic activity in the region. The project, funded by a federal grant to investigate tectonic anomalies in the Four Corners region, had already yielded data that contradicted existing geological models of the area. Chen, a meticulous scientist with 15 years of field experience, had been drawn to geology by the discipline's blend of physics, chemistry, and detective work. He believed that given enough data and proper analysis, any natural phenomenon could be explained through established scientific principles. His assistant, Maria Rodriguez, was a brilliant graduate student from the University of Arizona whose expertise in seismic monitoring made her invaluable to the expedition. The Chuska Mountains, running along the Arizona-New Mexico border within the Navajo Nation, presented unique challenges for geological research. The remote terrain, with its steep canyons and limited access, required the team to pack in all their equipment by foot or helicopter. The cultural significance of the land to the Navajo people added another layer of complexity to their work, requiring careful navigation of tribal permissions and sacred sites. On June 17th, Chen and Rodriguez were working in a remote canyon approximately 12 miles from the nearest paved road. The canyon, carved from ancient sandstone over millions of years, was a geological marvel with exposed strata dating back to the late Cretaceous period. They had set up monitoring equipment to measure ground vibrations when their instruments began detecting unusual patterns. The morning had begun like most others in their expedition. Chen and Rodriguez had risen before dawn, breaking down their campsite and preparing for a day of data collection. The air was cool in the canyon bottom, though Chen knew it would reach well over 100 degrees by midday. As they worked, the sounds of their equipment were the only disruption to the canyon's natural silence, punctuated occasionally by the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. "Look at this," Chen said at 10:42 a.m., pointing to the screen on his laptop. "These readings don't match any known geological formations. The seismic data displayed on Chen's screen showed patterns that defied explanation. The vibrations were regular in frequency and amplitude, creating a waveform that resembled nothing found in nature. Unlike the random signals typically produced by minor tremors or settling rock, these readings showed an almost mathematical precision that suggested an artificial origin. Rodriguez leaned in to examine the data, her brow furrowed in concentration. It almost looks like footsteps, heavy ones moving in a pattern. The similarity to footsteps was striking regular peaks in the data occurring at intervals of approximately 1.3 seconds, with each peak showing a complex harmonic structure that suggested weight being transferred and distributed in a pattern consistent with walking. What made this interpretation impossible was the scale of the readings. Chen adjusted the parameters on his screen, filtering out background noise and enhancing the signal. That's impossible. The weight distribution is wrong for any animal native to this region, and the timing is too regular for natural seismic activity. The calculations running through Chen's mind were troubling. Based on the amplitude of the vibrations, whatever was creating these signals would need to weigh several tons, far more than any mammal native to North America. Yet the regularity of the pattern suggested deliberate movement rather than the random motion of geological processes. At 11:07 a.m., Rodriguez pointed toward the canyon wall. "Did you see that?" Chen turned to see a figure disappearing behind a rock formation approximately 200 yards away. The movement was brief, almost peripheral, but enough to register as anomalous in the vast emptiness of the canyon. "Probably a hiker," he said, though he knew no trails existed in this remote area. The nearest marked trail was nearly 5 miles away, and they had seen no other vehicles at the access point where they had been dropped off by helicopter 3 days earlier. "Then why isn't there a vehicle parked anywhere nearby?" Rodriguez asked, her voice tinged with concern. "And why would someone be hiking in this heat without proper gear?" Rodriguez made a valid point. The temperature was already climbing toward 95 degrees, and the sun beat down mercilessly on the exposed canyon floor. Anyone hiking in these conditions would need proper equipment, water, and protection from the elements. The figure they had glimpsed appeared to be moving too easily through the rugged terrain to be an unprepared hiker. Chen set up his long-range camera with telephoto lens, scanning the area where the figure had disappeared. The camera, equipped with image stabilization and a 1200mm lens, could capture detailed images from distances up to a mile away under optimal conditions. For 10 minutes, nothing moved. The only sounds were the whir of the camera's autofocus mechanism and the distant cry of a circling hawk. Then, as he was about to give up, the figure emerged from behind the rocks. What Chen saw through his lens made his hands tremble slightly. The figure appeared human at first glance, but its proportions were wrong: limbs too long, torso too narrow, head elongated. It moved with an unnatural grace, covering ground with strides that seemed impossibly long. Each step carried it perhaps 15 feet across the uneven canyon floor. Yet it moved with a fluidity that defied its apparent size. "Get the video camera," Chen whispered, not taking his eye from the viewfinder. "Now." Rodriguez quietly retrieved the camera from their equipment bag, her movements careful and deliberate as she kept her eyes on the distant figure. The video camera, less powerful than Chen's still camera but capable of recording high-definition footage, would provide crucial documentation of whatever they were witnessing. As she began recording, the figure stopped and turned directly toward their position, though they were concealed behind rocks nearly a quarter-mile away. The figure's head swiveled with an unnatural smoothness, suggesting joints that moved in ways human anatomy didn't allow. "They can't see us," Chen said, though he didn't sound convinced. Not from this distance. The scientific part of Chen's mind insisted that at 1 in 300 feet, with no line of sight to their position behind the rock formation, the figure couldn't possibly have detected them. Yet the directness of its gaze suggested otherwise. The figure stood motionless for nearly a minute, then raised an arm and pointed in their direction. Rodriguez gasped as she zoomed in with the video camera. The hand had too many joints, the fingers ending in what appeared to be black claws rather than nails. The arm itself seemed to elongate as it pointed, extending beyond normal human proportions. At that moment, all their monitoring equipment began emitting high-pitched warning sounds. Chen looked at his laptop to see the seismic readings spiking to unprecedented levels. The regular pattern they had observed earlier was now accompanied by massive amplitude increases, suggesting vibrations of significant magnitude. "That's not possible," he said, his voice tight with disbelief. "There's no earthquake, but the ground is vibrating like we're having a massive one." Yet neither Chen nor Rodriguez felt any tremors. The vibration was registering on their equipment, but not through the soles of their feet. This discrepancy violated everything Chen understood about seismic waves, which should produce perceptible physical sensations at the intensities their equipment was recording. The figure began walking toward them, not directly, but in a zigzag pattern that made it difficult to track. Chen kept his camera focused, his scientific curiosity overriding his instinct to flee. Each step seemed to cover impossible distances, yet the figure moved with a deliberate, unhurried pace that suggested complete control over its movement. "Look at its shadow," Rodriguez said, her voice barely audible. "It doesn't match its shape." Chen adjusted his focus and saw what she meant. The figure cast a shadow that appeared to be that of a normal human, despite its clearly inhuman proportions. The shadow moved independently of the figure, sometimes lagging behind, sometimes moving ahead, as if it had a consciousness of its own. "This defies everything we know about physics," Chen muttered, documenting the phenomenon. Light and shadow should work consistently regardless of the object casting them. The anomaly of the shadow troubled Chen more than anything else he had witnessed. In his years of scientific research, he had encountered many phenomena that initially seemed inexplicable, but ultimately yielded to rational explanation. But the independent movement of a shadow violated fundamental principles of optics that had been understood for centuries. When the figure was approximately 100 yards away, it stopped and raised both arms. Chen and Rodriguez watched in horrified fascination as the figure appeared to grow taller, elongating by what seemed like several feet. Then it began to change shape, shifting from its humanoid form to something resembling a large canine, though the transition was smooth and impossible. The transformation defied biology as Chen understood it. There was no series of intermediate forms, no awkward period of adjustment, just a fluid, almost liquid-like reconfiguration of mass that seemed to violate conservation of matter. The canine form it assumed was unlike any species he recognized, larger than a wolf with proportions that suggested strength and speed beyond natural limits. At that moment, Rodriguez grabbed Chen's arm. "We need to leave, now." Chen finally lowered his camera, his scientific training giving way to primal fear. "I agree." They quickly gathered their essential equipment, leaving the heavier monitoring devices behind. As they scrambled toward their vehicle, Chen risked a backward glance. The figure had returned to its humanoid form and was watching them with what Chen could only describe as curiosity. There was no aggression in its stance, no indication that it meant them harm, only an unnerving, intelligent interest in their presence. They reached their vehicle and drove away without looking back. The rough terrain made for a slow departure, and Chen found himself constantly checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see the figure pursuing them with impossible speed. The canyon walls seemed to close in around them, casting shadows that now seemed menacing in their potential to conceal things beyond human understanding. When they reported the incident to the Navajo Nation police, they were met with knowing nods rather than surprise. Officer Tso, a veteran of the tribal police with 20 years of service, listened to their account without interruption, his expression unreadable. "You're not the first researchers to see things out there," Officer Tso told them when they had finished. "The Chuska Mountains have always been a place where the veil between worlds is thin." Tso's matter-of-fact acceptance of their story was almost as unsettling as the encounter itself. He took their statement without skepticism, asking detailed questions about the figure's appearance, movements, and the timing of events. He showed particular interest in their description of the shadow's independent movement, nodding knowingly when Chen described this anomaly. Chen and Rodriguez submitted their findings to the USGS, along with video evidence and seismic readings. The official report documented unexplained optical phenomena and seismic anomalies, but made no mention of the figure they had witnessed. Chen struggled with this omission, his commitment to scientific accuracy warred with the professional consequences of reporting something that would likely be dismissed as hallucination or fabrication. Privately, Chen confided in colleagues he trusted, describing what he had witnessed with the precision and objectivity that characterized his scientific work. Most responded with polite skepticism, suggesting that fatigue and isolation might have played tricks on their perception. A few, however, listened with genuine interest, sharing similar accounts they had heard from other field researchers working in remote areas. The video footage was analyzed by experts at the USGS, but showed only distortion and static when the figure was present. The seismic readings were verified as accurate, but remained unexplained. Chen spent months attempting to develop a scientific explanation for what they had witnessed, exploring theories ranging from atmospheric optical phenomena to localized magnetic fields affecting their equipment. None of these theories could account for all aspects of their experience, particularly the transformation they had witnessed. Rodriguez was deeply affected by the encounter, abandoning her plans for a career in field geology and switching to laboratory analysis instead. In an email to Chen 6 months after the incident, she wrote, "I can't unsee what we saw that day, and I can't make it fit into the scientific framework I've spent my life building. Some days I wonder if we stumbled upon something humans aren't meant to understand. Something that exists beyond the limits of our knowledge." Chen never returned to the Chuska Mountains, though he continued to study the data from that day until his retirement 3 years later. The seismic readings, unlike the video evidence, defied explanation and remained consistent with no known natural phenomena. Chen published a paper on these anomalies, carefully avoiding any mention of the figure they had witnessed. But the scientific community offered no satisfactory explanations for the patterns he documented. In his final years before retirement, Chen became interested in the intersection between traditional knowledge and scientific understanding, particularly regarding the Navajo concepts of the holy people and beings that exist between worlds. He interviewed tribal elders who spoke of similar encounters, though they described them in cultural rather than scientific terms. These conversations led Chen to question whether the scientific method, with its emphasis on reproducible results and material explanations, was adequate for understanding phenomena that might exist beyond conventional physical laws. On the 3rd anniversary of the encounter, Chen wrote in his private journal, "What we witnessed in the Chuska Mountains challenges the foundations of scientific understanding. I have spent my life seeking rational explanations for natural phenomena. But some things may exist beyond our capacity to comprehend." Perhaps the most honest scientific response to such encounters is not to force them into existing frameworks, but to acknowledge the limits of our knowledge and remain open to mysteries that defy explanation. The Chusca Mountain incident remains officially unexplained in USGS records, categorized as unidentified seismic and optical phenomena. For Chen and Rodriguez, however, it became a defining moment that reshaped their understanding of the natural world and the limits of human knowledge. In the vast, ancient landscapes of the American Southwest, they had encountered something that transcended scientific explanation, leaving them with the humbling recognition that some mysteries may never be solved within the boundaries of conventional science. Sheriff's Deputy Mark Jensen had patrolled the border areas of San Juan County for 12 years, dealing with everything from smuggling to domestic disputes. But nothing in his experience prepared him for the call he received on October 8, 2020. The dispatch came in at 6:43 a.m. from a rancher reporting unusual tracks on his property. Jensen arrived at the Wilson Ranch at 7:15 a.m. to find the rancher, a man in his late 60s who had lived in the area his entire life, waiting by his pickup truck. "Morning, Deputy," Wilson said, his face pale. "I've seen a lot of strange things out here, but nothing like this." Jensen followed Wilson to a muddy area near a watering trough where cattle typically gathered. What he saw there made him pause. The tracks were unlike anything he had encountered in his years of law enforcement. They appeared to be footprints, but the proportions were wrong. Each print was approximately 18 inches long with only 3 toes, each ending in what looked like a claw mark. The stride between prints measured nearly 9 feet, impossible for any human Jensen knew of. "What kind of animal makes tracks like these?" Jensen asked, taking photos with his phone. "That's just it," Wilson replied. "No animal I've ever seen. And look at how they approach the water." Jensen followed the tracks back about 50 yards to where they began abruptly in the middle of a sandy area with no corresponding tracks leading to that point. It was as if whatever made the tracks had materialized out of thin air. "That's not the strangest part," Wilson said, pointing toward the water trough. "Watch this." He led Jensen to the trough where the tracks ended. The water level had dropped several inches overnight, though there was no sign of spillage on the ground around it. "We've had a drought for months," Wilson explained. "I check this trough every day. The water level shouldn't have changed like this." Jensen knelt to examine the area more closely. The ground around the trough was disturbed, but not in a way that suggested animals had been drinking. There were no additional tracks, no signs of struggle, no evidence that anything had been there except the impossible footprints. At 8:22 a.m., Jensen called for assistance from the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources. When biologist Dr. Karen Park arrived at 10:15 a.m., she immediately confirmed Jensen's assessment. "These don't match any known species," Park said, examining the tracks. "The pressure distribution is wrong for a bear, wrong for a mountain lion, wrong for anything native to this region." Park took plaster casts of several prints while Jensen documented the scene. As they worked, Jensen noticed something unusual about the cattle in the adjacent pasture. "Look at the herd," he said to Park. "They're all gathered at the far end of the pasture, as far from this watering trough as they can get." Park followed his gaze. Cattle are sensitive to predators. They must have sensed something last night. "But what?" Jensen wondered aloud. "There are no other tracks, no signs of a kill, no evidence of any threat besides these footprints." At 11:47 a.m., as they were completing their documentation, a Navajo Nation police officer arrived. Deputy Begay approached the scene with a knowing expression. "Morning, Deputy," Begay said to Jensen. "Dispatch said you'd found some unusual tracks." Jensen nodded. "Unusual doesn't begin to describe it. Have you ever seen anything like this?" Begay knelt to examine one of the casts. My grandfather used to tell stories about beings that could change form. He said they left tracks that couldn't be identified because they weren't fully of this world. Jensen felt a chill despite the warming morning air. With all due respect, officer, there has to be a logical explanation. Maybe there does, Begay replied. But maybe our logic isn't complete. Maybe there are things in this world that don't follow the rules we've established. The official incident report documented unidentified animal tracks of unknown origin, but made no mention of the supernatural explanations suggested by Begay. The plaster casts were sent to a lab at the University of Utah for analysis, but scientists there could only confirm that the tracks didn't match any known species. 2 weeks later, Wilson reported that his cattle refused to drink from that particular watering trough, even after it was cleaned and refilled. He eventually had it removed and filled in, though the ground where it had stood remained barren for months afterward. Jensen never found a satisfactory explanation for the tracks, though he thought about them often during his patrols. The case remained open in his files, a reminder that some mysteries exist beyond the boundaries of conventional understanding. On a cold November night in 2021, something unusual happened at KTNN, the radio station serving the Navajo Nation. Station manager David Yazzie had worked at the station for 23 years and thought he had experienced every technical problem imaginable. But what happened on November 5th would challenge everything he knew about broadcasting. The evening began normally, with DJ Mike Begay hosting his traditional music program from 7 p.m. to midnight. At 9:42 p.m., during a commercial break, Yazzie was in his office reviewing programming schedules when he heard something that made him stop what he was doing. Through the office speaker, he could hear what sounded like chanting in the Navajo language. But it wasn't part of any scheduled program. The voice was deep and resonant, speaking words that Yazzie couldn't quite understand despite his fluency in the language. He hurried to the control room where Begay was looking confused at his equipment. "Are you hearing this?" Yazzie asked. "I've been trying to find the source for the last 3 minutes," Begay replied. "It's not coming from any of our inputs. It's just appearing on the broadcast." Yazzie checked the transmitter logs. Everything appeared normal. The signal strength was consistent, the modulation levels were within parameters, yet the mysterious chanting continued. At 9:47 p.m., the chanting stopped, replaced by a voice speaking in English with an accent that Yazzie couldn't place. "They walk among you now," the voice said. "The barrier weakens with each passing season. Soon there will be no distinction between worlds." Begay immediately cut to a backup recording, but the voice continued over the music, as if it had somehow bypassed their entire broadcasting system. "This is impossible," Begay said, checking connections that he knew were secure. "Nothing should be able to override our system like this." Yazzie called their engineer, who was at home 20 miles away. "We're getting some kind of interference," he explained. "Can you check the transmitter remotely?" The engineer accessed their system remotely, but found nothing unusual. "Everything looks fine from here," he reported. "Signal strength is normal, no indication of any external interference." At 9:53 p.m., as Yazzie and Begay continued to troubleshoot, the voice returned, this time speaking in a language neither man recognized. The cadence was rhythmic, almost hypnotic, and Yazzie felt a strange sense of disorientation as he listened. "I'm going to shut down the transmitter," Yazzie said, reaching for the emergency cutoff switch. "Don't," Begay said, grabbing his arm. "My grandmother used to say that certain broadcasts shouldn't be interrupted. She said they serve as warnings." Yazi looked at his colleague, surprised by the unusual statement. Bigay was typically the most practical person on their staff, not given to superstition. "What kind of warnings?" Yazi asked. "The kind that prepare us for changes," Bigay replied. "The kind that tell us when the old stories are becoming real." At 10:02 p.m., the mysterious broadcast stopped as suddenly as it had begun. The station returned to normal operation, though neither man could explain what had happened or how the voice had managed to override their system. The next day, Yazi filed a report with the Federal Communications Commission, documenting the unusual interference. FCC investigators examined their equipment, but found no evidence of hacking or external signal intrusion. The official report cited unidentified transmission anomaly of unknown origin, but offered no explanation. What was most puzzling was that listeners throughout the Navajo Nation had heard the broadcast. Yet recordings made by individual listeners showed only static during the time when Yazi and Bigay had heard the mysterious voice. It was as if the broadcast had been directed specifically to the station itself rather than to their audience. In the weeks that followed, Yazi noticed an increase in calls from listeners reporting unusual sightings and encounters throughout the reservation. Most spoke in hushed tones, as if afraid of being overheard. Many referenced the broadcast, though Yazi had never mentioned it publicly. The most unsettling call came on November 19th from an elderly woman living in a remote area near Shiprock. "They're becoming bolder now," she said. "The broadcast you heard was a warning. The barrier between worlds is thinning, and soon we will all see what our ancestors have always known." Yazi never found a rational explanation for the mysterious broadcast, though he continued to research similar incidents at other stations serving tribal lands. He discovered that such occurrences were more common than most people realized, though they were rarely reported officially or discussed publicly. The incident at KTNN remains unexplained in FCC files, a technical anomaly without precedent or resolution. But for Yazi and those who heard about it, it served as confirmation that some mysteries exist beyond the boundaries of conventional understanding. Search and Rescue Coordinator Tom Martinez had overseen 147 rescue operations in the Four Corners region over his 15-year career. But none would be as strange as the call that came in on December 3rd, 2022. The dispatch came at 4:17 a.m. from a hiker who had managed to call 911 before his phone died. The caller, identified as 32-year-old Daniel Reed, had been hiking in the remote area of Monument Valley when he became separated from his group. His final words to the dispatcher were, "Something's out here with me. It's wearing their faces, but it's not them." Martinez assembled his team at first light, driving to the area where Reed's call had originated. They met with the remaining members of Reed's hiking party at the trailhead at 7:30 a.m. "We camped near this formation," one of the hikers explained, pointing to a distinctive sandstone spire in the distance. "Daniel got up early to watch the sunrise. When we woke up, he was gone." Martinez noted the hiker's hesitation. "Is there something you're not telling me?" The hikers exchanged glances before the spokesperson continued. "During the night, we heard things. Movement around our campsite. Daniel said he saw figures watching us from the darkness." "What kind of figures?" Martinez asked, though he already suspected the answer. "That's just it," the hiker replied. "They looked like people, but they moved wrong. Too fast, too quiet. And when the moon hit them just right, their shadows didn't match their shapes." Martinez nodded, making notes. He had heard similar descriptions from other search operations in the region, though he never included them in his official reports. At 8:15 a.m., Martinez's team began their search, spreading out in a standard grid pattern. The terrain was difficult, with deep sand and steep rock formations that made progress slow. By noon, they had found no sign of Reed. At 12:43 p.m., one of the searchers radioed in with an unusual discovery. "Coordinator, I've found something you need to see." Martinez met searcher Lisa Chen at the base of a narrow canyon. What she showed him made him pause. In the sand were footprints that appeared human at first glance, but were wrong in several ways. "They're too deep," Chen explained. "Whatever made these was heavier than a person Reed's size. And look at the spacing." Martinez measured the distance between prints, nearly 7 feet. No human could maintain this stride in this terrain. The most unsettling aspect was that the tracks appeared and disappeared abruptly, with no approach or departure. It was as if whatever made them had materialized and dematerialized at will. At 2:28 p.m., as the team continued their search, they found Reed's backpack at the base of a cliff face. His phone, camera, and water bottle were still inside, but there was no sign of Reed himself. Martinez examined the area carefully, noting something unusual about the cliff face above where the backpack had been found. There were marks in the stone approximately 8 feet off the ground, as if something had climbed there. But the rock face was nearly vertical with no apparent handholds. "These marks don't make sense," Martinez said to Chen. "No human could climb this surface without equipment." Chen photographed the marks, while Martinez continued to search the area. At 3:15 p.m., he found something that made his blood run cold: a series of handprints in the sand near the cliff face, each with 6 fingers. The search continued until sunset without any further sign of Reed. Martinez called off the operation as darkness fell, planning to resume at first light. That night, as Martinez and his team camped near the search area, they experienced phenomena that none would officially report. Movement around their campsite, whispers in a language they didn't recognize, and the feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. At 2:17 a.m., Martinez was awakened by a sound outside his tent. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside to find a figure standing at the edge of their campsite. It appeared to be Reed, but something was wrong with his appearance. His face was pale, his eyes dark voids, and he moved with an unnatural stillness. "Danielle," Martinez called out, though he knew it wasn't the missing hiker. The figure turned its head slowly, a movement too smooth to be human. Then it raised a hand, and Martinez saw that it had 6 fingers. Before he could react, the figure turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness despite the open terrain. The next morning, Martinez's team found Reed sitting exactly where Martinez had seen the figure the night before. He was dazed and dehydrated, but otherwise unharmed, with no memory of the past 36 hours. "They showed me things," Reed said as Martinez led him back to camp. "Places that exist between here and there. They said the barrier is thinning, that soon we'll all see what's been hidden." Reed's official report documented him as disoriented and dehydrated, but made no mention of his strange statements. Martinez included the unusual footprints and handprints in his report, but classified them as unidentified animal tracks, rather than acknowledge their inexplicable nature. The search and rescue operation was officially closed as a successful recovery, but Martinez knew that something unexplainable had occurred in the desert that day. He had seen things that challenged his understanding of the natural world, things that aligned with the stories told by the Navajo people for generations. Reed never returned to the Four Corners region, though he occasionally sent Martinez emails with cryptic messages about the thin places and beings that walk between worlds. Martinez saved these messages in a special folder, a reminder that some mysteries exist beyond the boundaries of conventional understanding. Elementary school teacher Rachel Thompson had moved to the border town of Kayenta, Arizona in August 2023, excited about her position at the local primary school. As someone who had grown up in a large city, she was fascinated by Navajo culture and eager to learn from her students and their families. By October, Thompson had settled into her routine, though she noticed that her students occasionally spoke of things she couldn't quite understand. They would mention the tall people who lived in the canyons, or the shadow walkers who came out at certain times of the year. Thompson attributed these stories to cultural folklore and encouraged her students to share them during show and tell. The incident that would change her perspective occurred on November 7th, 2023. The day began normally, with Thompson teaching her third-grade class the standard curriculum of reading, writing, and arithmetic. At 10:42 a.m. during recess, she noticed something unusual. All her students were gathered at the edge of the playground, staring toward the mesa that rose behind the school. When Thompson approached, several of them pointed excitedly. "Look, Miss Thompson," one girl said. "One of the holy people is watching us." Thompson followed their gaze, but saw only the familiar landscape of red rock and sparse vegetation. "I don't see anything," she said gently. "They hide themselves from those who don't believe," a boy explained. "But we can see them." Thompson made a mental note to discuss this with the school's cultural liaison, though she didn't consider it particularly unusual. Children had active imaginations, and these stories were part of their cultural heritage. At 2:17 p.m., as the school day was winding down, Thompson was leading her class in a reading exercise when the classroom door opened slowly. No one was there, though the door had been latched from the inside. The children grew quiet, several of them looking toward the empty doorway with expressions of fear rather than surprise. Thompson walked to the door and looked into the hallway, which was empty at that time of day. "That's strange," she said, turning back to her class. "The wind must have blown it open." One of her students, a quiet boy named Thomas, raised his hand. "Miss Thompson, can we go home now?" Thompson checked the clock. "School isn't over for another 20 minutes, Thomas. Is everything okay?" Thomas looked toward the doorway again. "They're here now, the ones who wear different faces." Before Thompson could respond, the lights in the classroom flickered erratically, though the weather outside was clear and calm. Several of the children began speaking in Navajo, their voices low and urgent. At that moment, the school's cultural liaison, Mrs. Yazzie, appeared at the classroom door. "I think it's time for these children to go home," she said, her expression serious. Thompson was confused, but trusted Yazzie's judgment. "Is there some kind of emergency?" "Not the kind you're used to," Yazzie replied as she helped the children gather their belongings. "Some days are different. Some days the barrier between worlds is thin." Thompson watched as Yazzie led the children from the classroom, their usual chatter replaced by a quiet urgency. She followed them into the hallway, where she saw several other teachers releasing their students early as well. "What's going on?" Thompson asked the principal, who was standing in the main office. The principal, a Navajo woman who had been at the school for 20 years, looked at Thompson with an expression of pity. "Some things you learn to recognize. The signs were all there today. The children saw them first, of course. They always do." Thompson felt a chill despite the warm afternoon air. "Saw what?" The principal hesitated before answering. "Beings that don't belong in our world, but sometimes visit. Beings that can appear as anything or anyone, but whose true nature can be seen by children and animals." Thompson wanted to ask more questions, but she could see that the school staff was genuinely unsettled. She helped with the early dismissal process, noticing that the school's usually friendly stray dogs were nowhere to be seen, and that the birds that typically gathered in the trees around the playground had vanished. The next day, Thompson arrived at school to find everything back to normal. though none of the children would discuss what had happened the previous afternoon. When she tried to bring it up with Mrs. Yazzie, the response was cryptic. "Some things are better left unspoken," Yazzie said. "Acknowledgement gives them power. Ignoring them sends them back to where they belong." Thompson never received a satisfactory explanation for the events of November 7th. Though she noticed similar occurrences throughout the school year days when the children would suddenly become quiet and stare toward the mesa. Days when animals would disappear from the school grounds, days when staff would release students early without explanation to non-native teachers like herself. In her private journal, Thompson documented these incidents, though she never included them in official reports or discussed them with colleagues outside the Navajo staff. She came to accept that there were aspects of the culture and the land itself that existed beyond her understanding. The school never officially acknowledged these unusual occurrences, though Thompson noticed that the Navajo staff had protocols for dealing with them that were passed down informally from one generation to the next. These protocols weren't written down or formally taught, but were understood instinctively by those who had grown up with the stories. Thompson continued teaching at the school for 3 more years, learning to recognize the signs that the children saw so clearly. She never witnessed anything that could be scientifically documented, but she came to respect the knowledge that her students and their Navajo teachers carried a recognition that some mysteries exist beyond the boundaries of conventional understanding. The American Southwest remains vast and unknowable, a landscape where ancient traditions meet modern skepticism in ways that challenge our understanding of reality. The accounts we've explored tonight, from the park ranger's impossible sighting at Canyon de Chelly to the school children who see what adults cannot, form a pattern that cannot be dismissed as mere coincidence or cultural superstition. What makes these encounters particularly compelling is their consistency across time and culture. The entities described by Navajo people for generations are now being witnessed by outsiders, government workers, medical professionals, educators, and law enforcement officers who have no prior knowledge of such traditions. Yet their descriptions align with remarkable precision, suggesting that something exists beyond our current understanding of the natural world. The Navajo people have long understood that certain places serve as thresholds between worlds. They have developed protocols for protection, ceremonies for balance, and a deep respect for powers beyond human comprehension. As modern civilization continues to encroach upon these sacred lands, the encounters have increased, suggesting that the barrier between worlds is indeed thinning, as so many witnesses have described. Science seeks to explain, categorize, and understand the world through observation and experimentation. But what happens when we encounter phenomena that defy explanation? What happens when the tools of modern inquiry prove insufficient to document what so many have witnessed? These questions lie at the heart of the accounts we've explored tonight. The witnesses in these stories, from the geologist who couldn't explain his seismic readings to the search and rescue coordinator who found tracks that defied physics, share a common experience. The moment when rational understanding gives way to something deeper, more mysterious, and ultimately unexplainable. In that moment, they become part of a tradition that stretches back generations, joining those who have glimpsed what exists beyond the veil. What these accounts suggest is not that we should abandon scientific inquiry, but rather that we should expand our understanding of what is possible. The Navajo people have maintained for centuries that reality consists of multiple layers, that beings exist who can move between these layers, and that certain times and places serve as thresholds where passage becomes possible. Perhaps it is time for modern society to consider that these traditions may contain knowledge that science has yet to acknowledge. The silence that follows these encounters is perhaps their most profound aspect. Unlike typical horror stories that seek to shock or terrify, these accounts leave witnesses with a quiet recognition that something beyond their understanding has touched their lives. This silence is not empty, but filled with the weight of mystery. The acknowledgement that some questions may never have answers within our current framework of knowledge. As we consider these accounts, we are reminded that the world remains larger and more mysterious than our modern sensibilities allow. The Navajo people have maintained this understanding through generations of oral tradition, preserving knowledge that modern society is only beginning to glimpse through these encounters. The American landscape holds many secrets, but perhaps none as profound as those contained in the deserts, mesas, and canyons of the Southwest. Here, in the vast spaces between cities, in the silence of the wilderness, something ancient and mysterious continues to manifest entities that defy explanation, but refuse to be dismissed entirely. If you or someone you know has a true story to share, leave it in the comments below. Your experiences help build a more complete picture of these phenomena and may provide insights that others seeking understanding will find valuable. Thank you for watching Sleepless Campfire. Until next time, stay safe out there.